Welcome to Gray Overload. And Intel has done a statement on the failing processors, which is this is going to be a follow-up video to the last video I did about this. Now, Intel did a statement to Iger's lab about this, talking about the operating conditions, kind of blaming pretty much blaming the motherboard manufacturers providing end users with a default BIOS profile that doesn't match Intel's recommendations. Now, if you haven't read the Iger's Lab, I highly recommend you do so. I will put it in the description below. And then I would also recommend you watch the Hardware Unbox assessment of it because it's interesting what Hardware Unbox does at the end. He pulls up a couple of links to Anantech when Ian Cutress had done an interview with an Intel fellow or Intel engineer or something like that, and talked about the specification of the processors, which said the processors that the motherboards or the specification that the motherboards are in spec. They do not consider them out of spec based upon it has not clicked over and enabled their overclocking bit that is on their processor. So that's why I'd highly recommend you take a look at this. I know a lot of people were putting all the blame on the motherboard manufacturers, and I was more of, I think this is a to blame game. I think that they're both responsible for this. Now, in my opinion, what needs to happen here is that both sides, and I know Intel's already passed the buck onto the motherboard manufacturers, and Intel can do that because the motherboard manufacturers signed an agreement being able to use and manufacture motherboards for Intel. So, motherboard manufacturers are kind of stuck in the rock and a hard place. They can't come out blaming. I guess Intel could pull the motherboard, that contract or however that's signed. I highly doubt it because Intel right now is not in a position to really, force that, but they could. And so it kind of puts motherboard manufacturers, they're relying on Intel for a lot of stuff, right? New processors, new chipsets, all that other stuff. But, Intel has this contract and stuff, and they did not uphold and enforce of what they wanted and the outcome of that contract between motherboard manufacturers and for the chipsets and everything else for those specifications and for what processors they have. I think that this, going forward, what needs to happen, getting back to this, is that Intel needs to go, we're going to favor and put in the baselines. If you want to have everything else, users can change off the baselines, users can set and go from there, but the operating expectation needs to be that people are going to build their computers. They may not touch it, especially if there's their first build, right? Second build, third build, they may not get into even messing with anything. They may do a lot of builds and never go through and mess with inside the BIOS, change the voltages and everything else. But what needs to happen is that baseline, whatever it is, from AMD, Intel, all these motherboard manufacturers, it needs to be stable across the lifetime of that device, at least for the warranty period, right? And granted, you don't want a whole bunch of processors or motherboards failing right after the warranty period because guess what? You're going to have some bad press. So that's where I think Intel needs to go with this going forward. Right, they push the processors. You can hear about the KS being pushed a lot, and you can hear, it could be a boosting algorithm, whatever else. But with the power limits, everything else that they've considered, you just have to realize that, not everyone is going to be upgrading their BIOS. I'd like that to be easier. I'd like that be more normalized, but not everybody does it. I mean, in your corporate network, you have, Dell has a command center, Lenovo has a command center that does all of these things for the user and upgrades and manages that through, through IT and everything else. But the normal user right now is not going through and updating the BIOS unless they're being, wanting to go get a new feature or be able to drop in a new processor. So you're going to have a lot of devices out there that don't have this profile that Intel is going to want out. And we have Gigabyte, MSI, and Asus all having, those three I know for sure I've read, and I'm sure all soon will have a Intel baseline profile. It should just be like the normal profile. um, like I said, you wouldn't consider them overclocked because according to, an Antex article there by Ian Cuttress, that technically hasn't happened yet unless you enable it, to have the overclocking bit enabled. So, Intel says that they will be publishing a public statement regarding the issue and Intel's recommendation on BIOS setting recommendations targeted for May 2024. And this gets back into it, like who's really to blame, right? And you could say, well, users can take care of it, or the blame game really doesn't matter. You're going back and forth. But one, the Intel manufactures the processors, so they need to take some responsibility. And this shows some sort of, we'll turn a blind eye as long as you get us the best scores out there, so we look good in reviews or in the tech press. And that sort of communicate, that's what I got kind of out of this statement to Igor's lab, is that sort of thing. Like, so you weren't doing recommendation settings. I know that they have, PL1, PL2 recommendations for your power limits and everything there, but usually, when you work like this, I mean, you hear stories about NVIDIA and their control over how the BIOS are, how their power limits are, and their control over their board process. you know, you think Intel does some of that same sort of things with motherboards and how they're developed, especially, starting a processor and seeing where they are. And Intel's been able to see the tech press about this for years. I think in Hardware Unboxed, he mentioned 10 years of this. I know it's been a long time of many hardware reviewers talking about, hey, can we get a normalized, baseline to all of these motherboards out here for the Intel processors? And to, some extent AMD, right? You have PBO, but there's been a lot more consistency there than on the Intel side. And so we have just a baseline to go after, and then if somebody wants to enable a different power limit or a different overclock or whatever else, they are free to do that. And I think that this is where Intel kind of loses me of just blaming the motherboard manufacturers. Well, they should have just did embed in the power limit recommendations. At some point, I think this would still have popped up, whether from Intel or AMD. I think this is a reality check for both of them for the reason of it needs to be able to plug in, work, and be reliable for people over the extent of at least the warranty period, but hopefully longer. And that way people are off to running and playing their games and not focusing on adjusting their hardware. Well, as you get more advanced, you can set limits, you can, set a whole bunch of different stuff that you want, voltages, whatever you want, and really push the computer until, people get comfortable. They're not going to do that. And for those people that are buying hardware, they want something that's not going to crash on them. They want it to be reliable. So there is, I think, well, let's put blame on both Intel and the motherboards, and they should be responsible for it, and they should own up to it. They shouldn't just pass the buck off to one or the other. They should say we should have been within spec for the motherboard manufacturers, and we should have maybe pushed Intel to make sure that this is it. Maybe they did say, Intel, this is kind of what we can get out of it. This is what, this is in your specs. But if you want, here are the scores from each. What do you want us to do? And maybe it was Intel. Will we ever hear that? I'm sure that there's an NDA someplace making sure that if that was said, it is not coming out. So let me know what your thoughts are. This is, hopefully going to end soon with Intel's statement, and hopefully it's going to get cleaned up where we're going to have a better process here in the future, and hopefully AMD take note so that we do get a stable process. If you want to go and push your processor, get the most out of it, by all means go and do so at your own risk, right? I'm going to say at your own risk, so you don't come back, you told me to go do it, right? But, Intel enables those, especially on the K processors, to be able to do it. AMD has it on all their processors, so yeah. And so you can go and do that and get the extra performance that you want. But if somebody just is going to buy the equipment off the shelf and plug it in, it's going to work and work reliably, and you're not going to have those crashing issues. I think if you're having crashing issues and you overclock and modify the hardware, that's a whole different scenario. It's the out of the box stuff that is very concerning. So thank you so much for watching Great Overload and helping this channel grow. Let me know that your thoughts are, and that we're now getting more stuff out there from this. And do you think that Intel is going to have a good um, plan going forward? I'm sure that all these motherboard manufacturers, and maybe it is going to be called Intel Baseline. That name isn't horrible, I have to say. Um, all motherboard manufacturers have Intel Baseline as their default, and then you can go from there. Intel, maybe you should, use that name that everyone's named, or everyone's using. So with that, leave in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, sharing, liking, subscribing, hitting the bell icon, and watching another one of my videos. It really does help with the channel. And until next time, God bless.